If you're using Angular 17, you should stop using ngFor and use the new control flow syntax for looping over iterables. So in this lesson, we are going to cover the new for syntax in your Angular templates for looping over iterables. As usual, this entire lesson is available online, link in the description. In our site, we have the guide for this lesson step by step, as well as a playground where you can play with the new for syntax. So check out our site, the link is in the description. Angular 17 is shipped with the new control flow syntax. This means we now have additional syntax to write those common structural directives like ngFor, ngIf, ngSwitch. And in this lesson, we're going to discuss about the syntax for looping over iterables. What we used ngFor. Since Angular 17, it's recommended to stop using ngFor and use this new syntax instead. And we will explain in this lesson the benefits of this new syntax. So first of all, in the new syntax, track is now mandatory. So track was a cause for many performance problems in Angular applications. The lack of knowledge of track for Angular developers, Angular not optimizing the DOM elements in the ngFor and replacing a lot of DOM elements that it shouldn't because developers didn't supply those track by function. And the track by function in ngFor was a really bad API, which is now drastically improved. So in the new syntax, track is now mandatory. The old syntax is still supported, what will allow us in this lesson to create an Angular application and compare between the old syntax, the ngFor, and the new syntax, the for, in our Angular templates, and see the difference in the benefits in the new syntax. And in the future, there might be an automation tool that will help you transfer that old syntax of ngFor to the new for syntax. So to learn about the new syntax, let's create a new Angular application and create components with ngFor and a component with for, and try to compare between the new syntax and the old syntax. So I'll create a new Angular application. I'll npx Angular CLI latest, and I'll call new, and let's say for demo, create a project called for demo and pass the flag minimal. So the minimal will create minimal files and no tests, no external styles, no external templates. At the time of this recording, we are using the latest Angular, which is 17.0.9. That's okay to proceed. It will ask us a few questions. Let's see which style sheet we want to use. Doesn't really matter, so we'll just pick CSS. We're not going to focus on styling in this lesson. And do we want to enable server-side rendering? No, we do not. We're not going to focus on server-side rendering in this lesson. We'll give it a few seconds to create the project, and then we'll open the project with VS Code. So we opened the new created project with VS Code. Let's create a component that we will write the new for syntax, and a component for comparison with the old ngFor syntax. So I'll open the terminal and I'll create two components. One component for the old ngFor and one for the new for. So I'll use Angular CLI to generate those components. So npx ng generate component, and we'll name the component new for. It's going to be with an inline template, and we'll inline style as well, and we'll also add skip tests. Okay, so we created the new for component, and let's generate another component for comparison with the old ngFor with inline template, inline style, and going to skip tests creation. So we created those two components. Let's open those two components one by one and side by side, and let's compare those two syntaxes. So I'll grab the new for syntax and I'll open it in one side, and I'll grab the old ngFor and open it in another side. So we have those two components that we can compare, the old and the new. I'm going to also place those components on the screen. So to place them, I'm going to open the app component, and in the app component I am going to let's close them for a second. I'm going to import those new components that I just created. The new for, and I'm going to import the old for component, old ngFor. And to place them on the screen, I'm going to the imports. I'm going to place those two components. And now we can place those their tags. So I'm going to create the app new for and the app old ngFor. So now if I open my app with ngserve, I should see those components are placed. Okay, so I have the new for and the old ngFor. We can now compare between them, and in the IDE, I'm going to open those two files side by side. So I'm going to the new for and the old for, and I'm going to open them side by side. The old ngFor is on the right, the new is on the left, and now we can start comparing between those two syntaxes, the old ngFor and the new structural directive for syntax. So let's start comparing between the old ngFor and the new for syntax. So let's start with the old ngFor. So on the right we have the old ngFor. Let's say we have a books array to iterate over, where each item of the book contains an ID and a title. And let's populate a few of these books. And let's also place this array on the new syntax component on the left. So let's start with ngFor in over this array displaying each book title. So I can add an unordered list and add a list item, and then with the old ngFor we would do something like ngFor and then let book of books, and then I could add book dot, let's say, title. So this is the old syntax, right? So if I want to use the ngFor, and we are in standalone components, so I need to add in the imports. We see in here the ngFor is marked because I need to add in the imports.common module. So let's add here the common module, and now the alert on the ngFor is gone. And if we go to our browser, we should see our list is displayed. So great, this is the old ngFor. Now let's do something similar. Simple example of the new syntax. So in the new syntax, I'll add a UL. But now if I want to loop over and create li items, I can create the for book of books. Oh, sorry, book of books, and add an li of book title. Now notice that when I did this, there is an exception that Angular marks this, what I wrote, the new for, with an alert, and the reason is we have to add a track expression. So on the right, track by was optional, but in the new syntax, track is mandatory, and if you don't add a track, Angular will alert you on that. So you have to add the track. So we'll add the track as the book ID. So now it's working, and if we go back to our screen, it's showing the new list as well. So first of all, I don't need to add the common module. On the right, I have to add the common module, and here I don't have to add the common module for the new syntax. Also, the track is mandatory. So the track is used for Angular to know when to create those DOM elements and when to update those DOM elements. Let's give an example. So if I open the developer tool and examine those LIs, I should see the LIs, and now let's say I want to add in the old ngFor, I want to add a clone function. And what the clone function will do, it will iterate over the books, and every one of those books, it will create a copy of the object. So it will simply grab all those objects and create a new object instead. So now if I add, for example, let's add a button with a clone, and let's go over to the left side. If I click the clone here and I examine those li elements, notice those li elements. Notice in the browser those li elements, if I clone them, they're recreated. If you see in the developer tools, there's a blink of color in those li, meaning those li are getting replaced. Now if I go and create the same logic in the old ngFor, let's copy this clone method. Copy this button. So let's try in the new for. Let me add this developer tools on the right. So let's see those LIs here. This is the new for loop. Now I'm cloning and I see nothing is created. Well, in the bottom list in here, if I click the clone here, those are replaced. Notice the colors, and here the colors do not change, and here the colors change. And this fact, the fact that now Angular knows better when to replace the li elements and when to update those li elements, drastically improved performance and was the cause of many performance issues in a lot of Angular applications. So now the track is mandatory, and it's for good reason, and it's highly recommended to make it mandatory. In fact, there is also a lint rule that a lot of places activate that force ngFor to add a track by. So a lot of companies that I visited, I noticed that they activate this rule to make the developers force the developers to add track by to the ngFor. So it was requested that the track would be mandatory, and it's for good reason. And the track API is much better and cleaner. You can simply grab the object, the book object, and if that book object contains a primary key, you can simply specify the primary key of that book object. Whereas in the ngFor, if I wanted to supply a track by, it looked like this, track by, and then I needed to add a track by function. So let's say track by ID. And then I needed to create this function, track by ID, which gets an index and an item and can return the item ID. Let's say this is of type let's say ID number, and this is of type number. So this is, look at the equivalent of returning the item ID in the old syntax. You had to create a function and then return the item ID. And the new syntax is much cleaner. You can just grab the book that you aliased here and then return the ID. So the syntax for track is much cleaner. So track is now mandatory in the new syntax. The API is much cleaner and simpler, and it's good because it will save you a lot of performance issues in your Angular applications. So the track, in my opinion, is a big benefit in the new for syntax. The track allows Angular to do the minimum amount of DOM change when our array is updating. And we saw that the ngFor, the track by, is optional, and the API is a bit clumsy. You have to supply a function, and that function needs to return the uniqueness of each item of the array. In our case, the primary key, the ID, wherein if you want to return the primary key, you simply, in the new syntax, simply grab, say which property in the object is your primary key, and the API is much cleaner and simpler. By the way, you can still use the old API in the new for syntax. So instead of supplying book ID, I could supply here a function if I have something that is more complex calculation regarding the uniqueness of each item in the array. I can supply a function here. So you can still use the old API for if you have something more complex that specify the unique item in your array. So the ngFor track by is optional, and in the new for, it's mandatory. The optional track by was the cause of many performance issues. We'll see in the documentation, they specifically say that with ngFor, loops over immutable data without track by are the most common cause of performance bugs across Angular application. This is taken from the Angular documentation. So this, we saw also a comparison between what Angular do when you don't supply a track by. Angular might recreate the DOM element when it needs to update the DOM element. And we saw a comparison with the clone. So let's check another benefit of the new syntax is that you can now supply, after the for block, you can supply a special block in case your array is empty or null or undefined. You can supply an empty block. So this is a common case that in the old syntax, when we had to use the ngFor, we had to specifically add an ngIf in the case where our array is empty. It was very common and very annoying. So now in the new syntax, you have an additional empty block case that really saves you that additional ngIf. So it looks something like this. After the for, you can add additional block of an empty, which saves you that annoying ngIf that you had to use in the cases where your array was empty. So let's check out that empty block. So I'll go back to my code, and after the for, I can add an empty block, and an empty block will be displayed if my books is empty or null or undefined. So if my books is empty, like in this case, the empty will be displayed. Let's say my books is array of any, and the empty will be displayed if my array is empty. So in here, let's say I have an li no books. So now I should see no books is displayed. Whereas in the old syntax, if I wanted to create this this case where I want to display no books if the array is empty, I would have to do something like this. So if I'm, let's say, li ngIf book length is 0, then display no books. So I had to do something like this, and let's say my books is any. So I had to do something like this, right? So now I have the book has implicitly any type. So let's say any array. Okay, so now I have no books here as well. But what if our books had an empty? Let's say we had, for example, null case. Say your books is any, and let's remark the clone. So now I have the I have a clone here. So let's place this in remark. So now I don't have there is no length. So in here, let's say the books, ngF books. So this kind of starts to get a bit ugly, because now I need to ngF books. What if my books can be null, undefined, or an empty array? So now the ngF doesn't have a length, so I need to do something like this. But in here, the empty block will catch also null and undefined, which is comfortable. So in here, sorry, implicit has an any type. So let's say any array. Let's place the clone in comment, and let's place this in comment. Okay, so now I have no book. So it also works if I have the case where my array is null or undefined. So the empty is much more comfortable than playing with that ngF. And in some cases, you might also need to display ngF, else display the ngFor, which was also very annoying. So the empty case, empty block really saves you a lot of hassle with the ngF else that you add to add on the old syntax. Let's talk about contextual variables. And this is not a benefit of the new syntax. We have contextual variables in the old syntax and the new syntax, and we're talking about different variables that your loop has. So you can ask Angular for a count variable to count the number of items in your array, in your iterable. You can ask for the index, which will be updated every iteration of the loop with the index of that iteration. You can ask if the item is the first item or the last item, which are booleans, will return true or false. You can ask if an item is even or odd, which will also be true or false, depending if the index is even or odd. So you can ask the contextual variables also in the new syntax and the old syntax. Just something that I wanted to show how the new syntax, how you access these variables in the new syntax. And also it's common when you don't have a unique primary key in your array, it's common to add a track of index. So we'll see that in a second. But the general API to grab those contextual variables is to define alias. Let idx, for example, is an alias in this example to access the index of the current iteration. So let's see that at this example. So let's say I want to print next to the book, I want to print the number of that iteration. So I can access it with let id equals index. And let's say I want to say if the items is the first one or last one. So I can say let is first equals $first. So this will be true at the first one, and then at the rest will be false. And then I can print those just with the alias. So I'm just going to print the alias and print the is first. So let's see the result. So if we go to the browser, oh, I don't have books, so let's restore the books. So I have an array of where each item of the array will be let's populate it with a few books. Oh, sorry. Okay, that's enough books. And let's go back to our browser, and we see the ID, the current iteration of the loop, and we see a true at the first element and a false in all the other elements. And if I wanted the same in the old ngFor, so let's see how it looked in the old ngFor. It was I can say grab the index as I, for example. Sorry, it's index, not with the dollar, and then I could place the I here, for example. And we need also books as well, so let's copy the books array here. And we'll see 0, 1, 2, 3. And we have also no books because of the first if. Let's remove this. Okay, so this is how we access those contextual variables. In the old ngFor, it's a bit different. You need to alias them with as, whereas in this example, you alias them with the let. Also, it's very common, for example, if you have books which are, let's say our books are strings. Book 1, book 2, and the string is not necessarily unique. So we can have a repeating string here. We can have book 2 and another book 2. So if you don't have anything that is unique, you don't have a primary key to track by, then you can simply track by index. This is like a last resort, and let's remove. We have a few problems here. Let's print the book, track by index. Let's remove this. And let's remove the is first. And sorry, to track, it should be index. Okay, so if you don't have anything unique in your array, you don't have a primary key, you can just track by the index location of the item in the array, which is good enough default. In this case, you cannot have a perfect track by, but it will be a good enough default. So in case you don't have anything unique, you should use the index as your track. To summarize this lesson, we saw the benefits of using the new control flow syntax for looping for iteration that should replace the ngFor, and we highly recommend to stop using ngFor and use the new syntax. Of course, if you're using Angular 17, since this new syntax is only available from Angular 17. And just to summarize the benefits that we saw in the new syntax, so first of all, I think it's much cleaner and readable, the new syntax. It's really easy to understand where your for begins and where your for ends, because you have those curly brackets that really reminds you of JavaScript for, right? If you're using ngFor, it's harder to see where your for begins and ends because it's part of the DOM element, so it's kind of harder to see. And with the new syntax, the syntax is much more readable to understand where your for begins and ends. You have the track in the new syntax, which is now mandatory with a much simpler API. So you can just specify the object primary key instead of having to supply a function like the old ngFor. So it's also, we saw that there is a handy empty block in the case where your array is empty or null or undefined, which saves you the hassle of adding that ngIf for the edge cases where your array is empty. So thank you for listening. Like and subscribe if you like this content. Also, a source code for this lesson and a step-by-step guide is available in our site, link in the description, completely free, no need to register. You also have a playground in the site where you can play with the new syntax, because we learn by writing code. So check out the site and try to experiment with the new syntax to actually embed the lesson material. That's it. Thank you for listening.